Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Ideas with Michael Bach. The session will begin promptly at the top of the hour. Sit back, relax, and get ready for a great conversation. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for the premiere episode of Ideas with Michael Bach. I'm your host, Michael Bach. My pronouns are he, him, and I am really excited to have you join us today for this inaugural premiere episode of this show. This is a new series that I launched this year to engage in a discussion about some of the most pressing issues in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or IDEA. A small minority of social conservatives have really taken over the conversation, and because they believe, in my opinion, that treating people with dignity and respect is somehow a leftist ideology. And they seem to believe that work in IDEA is part of some culture war, and obviously they're wrong. Problem is that small minority have managed to get themselves into positions of power, and they become very vocal and making people question the value of the work that we do in IDEA. And that's why I created this series, to elevate the conversation and to engage with IDEA practitioners and champions who can share their experiences, both good and bad, and help people learn from them. And I'm thrilled that so many of you have decided to join us today for this first episode. It's very exciting. Now, events like this take a lot to put on, and I want to say a special thank you to my team, as well to our serious sponsor, Dentons. Dentons is the world's largest law firm by lawyers and has taken their work in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility very seriously. I have had the pleasure of working with Dentons for nearly 20 years, and I'm honored to have them as a sponsor for this series. So thank you. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you are joining via the Zoom webinar platform, you will not be able to unmute yourself nor turn on your camera. Additionally, you'll only be able to send messages in the chat to the hosts and panelists. We do this to ensure that people who may disagree with what we're talking about aren't able to disrupt the session. If you have any technical issues or questions, please use the chat function, and my producer, Mike, who also doubles as my husband, will be happy to assist you. If you're joining us on the live stream, you will be able to make comments, and it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, please make sure they're respectful. We can disagree without resorting to calling people names. My guest and I are going to chat, but you are able to engage and ask questions. If you're on the Zoom platform, please ask your question using the Q&A function, and you can ask them at any time, and we'll work them into the conversation at an appropriate time. If you're joining us via the live stream, you can also ask a question by posing it on the platform you're on, and we'll do our best to respond to them as well. The show is being recorded and will be available as a podcast in about a week. If you want to know more about the podcast or download an episode, please visit my website at michaelbach.com/ideas. or look for Ideas with Michael Bach on your favorite podcast platform. Okay, that's about covers the housekeeping, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. On today's episode, we'll be exploring the theme of data and measurement. How do you measure the impact of IDEA efforts? What data should you be collecting to understand if and when you've achieved your objectives? And how do you measure in a way that avoids being perceived as performative or just ticking the box? Sertrice Shipley is co-owner and chief consulting officer of Mattingly Solutions, a woman-owned diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. Sertrice is passionate about helping organizations use metrics to create data-driven DEI strategies that drive meaningful change. She serves clients through DEI executive advising, DEI measurement consulting, and building and delivering inclusive behavioral change solutions. Sertrice also makes time to give back to the community through various board positions and volunteer roles. She's presented at events such as Vibrant Pittsburgh's Regional Economic Inclusion Summit, Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and SHRM. Sertrice has her MS in Industrial Organizational Psychology, and she is located in Raleigh, North Carolina. Sertrice, welcome to the show.
Hello. I know. IO psychology, it's a mouthful.
A mouthful, and I'm sure everyone is wondering how quickly they can get an appointment so you can organize their psychology. That didn't make any sense. I am so pleased that you could be here for the first episode, because of course we only get to spend time together at SHRM conferences. So I'm excited to get to spend time with you outside. But speaking of books we've written, which we weren't, but how's that for a transition? Sertrice is the co-author of Inclusalytics, How Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leaders Use Data to Drive Their Work. And I have read this book, and it is filled with really great insights. If you're looking for a book that focuses on data and measurement in IDEA, look no further. And you can find more about the book at inclusalytics.com. And we will put a link to that in the chat function, because I struggle to spell Inclusalytics. I don't know where my block is on that. All right, so let's start with learning a little bit about you. Tell me about the wonderful and talented Sertrice Shipley, how you got into this field. What's your journey about?
Yeah. And first, I'll just say real quick, it is fun making up words, and you can do that when you write a book, but then functionally just watching people stumble with it is like fun, but also kind of sad. So thank you for dropping the link. But yeah, so my journey, how I got here, well, we talked about industrial organizational psychology, right? So I was one of those kids, not to toot my own horn, but growing up, I did well in school. Didn't matter the subject. But the one class I took in high school that I really loved and wanted to keep learning about was psychology. However, I also knew maybe no one needed me as a psychologist. So when I went to college and I'm studying psychology, trying to figure out the next step, because you can't do anything with a BA in psychology, that's when I stumbled across this concept of industrial organizational psychology, which is the science of human behavior in the workplace. And with that, it really interested me because, like I said, I love people, I love psychology. And as adults, we spend most of our lives in the workplace, yet how many people are dreading going into the office on Monday morning? And so going into IO Psych, I felt like I could focus on that. How can I improve that experience for people so they aren't having that feeling all the time in the place where they're spending most of their time? And it also helps the business. So that's great. So I went to grad school, got my master's in IO, and after that was at a company where we focus largely on like engagement surveys, 360s, we're building reports, dashboards. And after being there for several years, it was then 2020 came, right? Everything explodes in the DEI space. I'm our internal expert helping lay down foundations. I'm our external expert helping our clients. And that's when eventually I realized, oh, wow, that's what really I was passionate about, right? If we think back to my original statement, I want to improve the experience for employees. It's DEI, it's equity and inclusion. And so that's what helped me realize I was ready to make a pivot. And so I am going to shout out Victoria real quick. I met her virtually in 2020, and then 2021, we were doing something similar to this. And at the end, I was talking to her about how, I think I want to pivot and focus more on DEI. And she's like, well, have you ever have you ever thought about owning a company? I was like, no, I have not. She goes, have you ever thought about writing a book? No, I have not. Within a couple months, I was on board and doing both. So been doing this for the past 3 years, and it's been great getting to use those IO skills and help organizations take a data-driven, intentional approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And figuring out how to run a business has been a task, but it's been fun and I've learned a lot. So that was a lot, but there you go.
That is a lot, but what I heard in my simple little brain is IO is about the psychology of the workplace, how people function together, which makes so much sense then that you ended up in the idea field, because that's all about what we're talking about, right? It's just how we engage with one another in the workplace. So you talk about this in the book, and I'm just going to do my Barker's Beauties here, my very dog-eared book. You talk about the types of measurement that are used in idea work. So can you talk to me just briefly about, things like quantitative and qualitative measurement and all that sort of thing?
Yeah. So when we talk about DEI and data, people they get nervous usually, right? They're either like, I don't know what that means, what it looks like. It's how do we start? And the answer is it depends, right? You have to think about what do you want to know? What are the questions? So like I said, I'm a psychologist, we're a STEM field, we're scientists, right? So what's your research question? And that's going to help you figure out what type of data you want to look at. And when we say the words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, accessibility, sometimes we act like they're all the same thing, but they're different. So for example, if I'm measuring diversity, it's as simple as looking around and saying, okay, how many people from each group do we have, right? So you can quantitatively look at what are your demographics. But if we're looking at equity, you have to take those demographics and combine it with your policies, practices, procedures to see how are those different groups experiencing your environment. So doing different equity analyses, and that can be quantitative and qualitative. And by that, it's like you can look at hard numbers, but you can also have conversations with people. Inclusion, that's a behavior. So you want to ask other people, right? How is this person treating you? And then you can measure that data in that way. Belonging, though, right? That's just how do people feel? Do you feel valued, respected,
Right.
seen, and heard? So that is where we get a little touchy-feely. We can quantify it, but it is still subjective, and that's okay because organizations are made up of people, and people have feelings, and those feelings matter. So that's real high level, kind of how that can look. All this to say, it's not one picture. It really depends. But definitely making sure you get some numbers involved so you can have some objectivity. But also some qualitative, so you can really hear the voice of the people you're trying to impact.
Right. I think those are so critically important. Difference. Let's try full sentences. The difference between data types and most organizations that I've ever talked to and discussed these things with are stuck on that demographic piece. They're stuck on the representation piece, the quantitative piece, which is important. You need to know who your people are, how they identify, so you know if you are representative of your community and of your customer. But that's a bit limited because you don't know how they feel. You can have, an office full of Black people, but if they're miserable, then they won't be as engaged, they won't be as productive, and so on. So it's really important to have those different pieces of data. So beyond what I just said, what is the most important thing people need to pay attention to as it relates to data and measurement in the idea space?
Yeah. So I started to touch on this some in the last question, but it's around making sure you're connecting your data to a purpose. What is your why? What's your why behind collecting data? What's your why behind focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Once you figure out your purpose, it helps you know what data to look at. But then another piece I would add on something that's important that can be overlooked, and you made me think of it, is looking at your data intersectionally. And this, I mean, in two ways. One, we're in the idea space, right? So all of you, when I said that, probably thought, oh yeah, like so Black women or Black men and looking across demographics. And that's true. That is intersectionality. That's where the term was coined as far as idea. However, it's also an analytical term. And when we talk about it in the data space, it's saying across sources of data. So don't just look at your counts for diversity, compare that to, okay, what data are we getting from our exit interviews? What are we seeing in our performance evaluations? And when you start looking at data from different sources and pulling it all together, that's where you get a full picture. Because as you started saying, Michael, if we just look and say, okay, yeah, great, we have diversity here, that's wonderful, we checked our numbers, that is not the whole picture. Where does that diversity lie? Is it through your whole organization? Is it just at one level, right? And when we start digging in, how do these people feel? They're here, but are they voluntarily leaving when we compare it to our turnover data? And you just have this burn and churn model going, right? So the diversity is there, but you can't sustain it. There's so many other pieces of that, right? And so to know, but again, tying back to my original comment, to know where to start starts with your why. What matters to us? What are our values? Your
Darn it. I knew it was going to happen once. If you can't understand the infamous business case, then, and that may seem simplistic, but the reality is that a lot of organizations still can't articulate that specific thing to say, this is why it matters.
Well, and with that, with the business case, sometimes we're afraid of it, right? Because, and especially, you know, I tell people this all the time, because I work in DEI, there are times when I feel icky because I'm monetizing it, right? And I have to get paid to do this work so I can pay my employees, so I can pay myself. But it can feel icky, right? And so the same thing happens with people when we say, well, remember the business case, right? Because they're all, well, it's the moral case. This is important because it's people and we should just care. Who cares about the business case? But we can't ignore it for two reasons. One, not everybody's going to believe in the moral. Sorry. So you have to appeal to them in some way to make them value this. But two, we also shouldn't ignore the fact that we are a business. We have values and priorities, right? So everything that we do should come back to our core purpose as a business. And so when you do that, it helps you know where to prioritize, where to focus, what to lean into. Because if you just start doing things here and there, you get disconnected, it's disjointed, and it makes things really difficult in bringing all of your actions together outside of just DEI, right? Because we say DEI is ingrained in everything. It's ingrained in your marketing and your selection and your product development. All of that is also tied together by your values.
Yeah, I feel similarly in that there are people who really do get who feel like this work should be exclusively in the social space. We should only do this because of the moral imperative. And I get that. And I come from a social justice background. You know, I grew up fighting the good fight and protesting and all those things. But the reality is that most, I'm going to use for-profit language, but most CEOs, most C-suite executives are not necessarily motivated by that language. They're not, you know, at the end of the day, if I'm the CEO of, I don't know, an oil and gas company, they are not getting paid because of their commitment to the moral imperative. They're getting rewarded because of their profits and their return to the shareholders. So I think one of the reasons why, frankly, I've been successful in this space is because I've looked at this as a business problem. And it's about, how do we function better as businesses? And ultimately, we're all in the people business until, of course, our robot overlords tire of us and shred us into the... No one seems to have seen Terminator, so I just keep reminding people. But, you know, we are in the people business. All of us, no matter what you do, you need people. And those people have to feel engaged. They have to feel connected. They have to feel like they matter in your organization. Yep. And so, you know, I don't have a problem with connecting it back to the business case, because that inevitably is what ensures the sort of long-term sustainability of the work that we do.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, please.
And I was just gonna say, one way I like to summarize what you were just saying is that it's both, right? It's not either or. We like to put those things against each other. I think it's both. And really, the moral case is the business case, right? Because what you just said, businesses are made up of people, so we have to prioritize our people. So it's still they're all related, and we have this like black and white. It's this or that. That's not the case. It's both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say are some of the biggest barriers to measurement right now?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Mm.
I always like to think of, and it's really interesting. And I could answer that in a few ways, but one that immediately comes to mind is having support, right? Making sure that your leaders are on board for two reasons. One, they hold the purse strings. And so if you need money, if you need support, they have to okay it. But two, they also have to champion it, right? They have to role model what you want. They have to tell people, yes, this actually matters and is important to us, or else no one's going to take it seriously. So making sure you have that foundational support is a barrier. Obviously, we're here to talk about data. My love for data, that is a barrier. Getting permission to collect data, getting access to the data, right? Because sometimes you have the data, but only certain people get to look at it because it's a secret. We can't let everyone know what our data is. Whole other issue, transparency, but I digress. And then, our societal landscape can be a barrier. People who have, I loved your intro to why you're doing the series, right? Because it's so true. We have taken something that should just be fact, right? It is, how do we improve our businesses, and our people are our business, so we should want to take care of them, into somehow politicizing this conversation. And so those are some of the key barriers that come to mind. And just not knowing what to do with that data. Even if you get permission, you're like, how do I start? What do I collect? What do I do with it when I have it? That's another one too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The conversation has gotten politicized. I was reading something the other day, some tweet, God help me. And someone actually suggested that the Alaska Airlines plane door blowing out was because of DEI. Because Alaska had somehow prioritized DEI over safety. And at first it was laughable, right? Like you hear that argument and you go, what? That's not a thing.
I
Are
don't
you,
even.
how did you come up with that? But that's the problem, is we've got people making some ludicrous claims. And it is really hurting the work we're doing. So let's talk about leaders for a second, because you mentioned leaders in there. How can you get leaders to kind of buy into the need for measurement and deal with that pushback?
Yeah. Well, one, that's where that data comes in, right? Those two things come really hand in hand. And I know it can be hard, chicken or the egg scenario, like, oh, if you need leader buy-in to get your data, how do you use the data to get their buy-in? So there's some external data sources you can look at, research best practices, because from my experience, whether it's your data or not, leaders love that. They eat it up. As soon as you say, here's this report, here's this study, look at this data point, and you have to boil it down. Don't give them the whole report, give them a few bullets, but they love it. They're like, oh, this is great. So-and-so's doing this. Get a competitor in there. Oh my gosh, they're done. You have all the support you need in the world, right? So really lean into that data, but you also need to have education. Now, I will say, when I'm helping organizations take this data-driven approach to DEI, we usually follow this model of collect your data, figure out, what's your starting point where you need to focus, strategize, make a plan, then you action that plan. So that might be your workshops, ERGs, whatever, and then measure some more, right? To see, are we having the impact? Do we need to pivot? So training is the third step in all of this process. You don't start there for the most part, for your large thing. That's the other piece of leader support. You need to have data to tie them in, but they may need education. They may need some simple guidance around, what do these words even mean? What is this space even about? So it's not a robust training program. Please do not try and get them into an allyship program or unconscious bias at this point. Just simple foundations. These are what these words mean and what it means to us here, and how it is a part of our already existing values. So that education mixed with some data, that'll usually get you the buy-in you need.
Yeah. And certainly I can speak from experience. You know, I used to lead diversity for a large accounting firm. And if I went in with an argument that didn't include data, I wasn't getting anywhere. I had to include that information. My measurement piece was so critical there. And because I have a lot of experience in data and saw the power of it, we got a lot done as a consequence of that. Now, the second thing you talked about was kind of having the data but not starting the analysis. How would you advise a client that already has some of this data to really to get into that analysis phase?
Yeah, great question. So if you have the data, or you have data in some way, or maybe you even just have permission to collect the data, what comes next, right? Well, one, like I said, make sure you know your why. What's the question we're trying to answer? Because that'll help you immediately start to see what data makes the most sense. But with that data, typically what you start with having is your HRIS. So you have that demographic data. And my first thing there is you can easily break that down. Start looking at it in different levels, see what you have going on, running some numbers, and compare that data to the industry. There are a lot of places you can look at for that. In your industry, there may be organizations who have some solid industry specific numbers. At a minimum, in the US, we have like our census data that you can pull up and see, who's eligible to work in the US at the broad scale. So there's a few different ways, because when we talk about diversity in your organization and representation, you want it to be representative of the community you serve, of the community you have access to. So that's where you can start a lot of times as a company. And then you can also, with your data, use, like I said, kind of use it to look across, compare it to your employee survey data, because that's another point where a lot of organizations can start. Most of them have at least one type of survey they're already looking at. Break it down by demographic. So those are usually two early ways to start with data.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah. Oh, one more.
Sprinkle
on top. I forgot, because those are both more quantitative. So I do want to sprinkle in that you can also start having listening sessions to start getting some qualitative data as well. There's a whole lot more I can say about qualitative data, and I honestly really recommend you getting a third party to do your more in-depth qualitative data analyses and even data collection. But never hurts to have a good town hall, right? And just hear from people in the moment.
Can we talk about that for a second? Because I think this is an important one, is the difference between internal collecting versus external collecting. And we have to acknowledge, of course, that, you're a consultant in this space. So this is going to come across as a bit self-serving. But, what would you advise a client around who collects the data, particularly things like focus groups, town halls, things where people can be really vulnerable? How do you advise on that?
So again, just to pull out the potential self-serving here and just have you think as a person for a minute. If your boss came to you right now and asked you really in-depth questions, right? Because some of these surveys get really long. Let's say they sit down and just asked you 50, 100 questions. Would you answer them truthfully? All of them. Some of them, maybe not all of them, right? That's the mindset your employees are in. When they know that it's internal, even if you tell them, oh, only this one area will have access, they start getting nervous. They're like, well, who truly has access? Can they be pressured into sharing the data? Like, who's going to get this? And so that trust makes it hard to collect data internally when we do that, even if it's a survey, but even more so with qualitative data, right? Because again, if you're in a focus group and you're asking questions, you can sit there and say, okay, this is anonymous, but you still see everyone. So they know who's there. They know the facilitator, if it's an HR person leading the conversation, right? And so that's why having that external party, it just helps build that trust barrier. It can help with quantitative data because, again, it's like, oh, this company has the raw data and they're only going to share aggregated reports. So they're going to combine my responses. I'm not identifiable. Helps build some trust there. But more importantly, like I said, just the visible aspect of collecting qualitative data, having someone outside of the organization And even better, if they can match the identity. Let's say you're trying to, chat with your Black women. If a Black woman could be the facilitator, also adds another level of comfortability and thinking she understands where I'm coming from. So those are some thoughts there.
Yeah, I come at it from a very similar perspective.
Yeah.
Again, former job days, we collected all the demographic information internally.
Mm-hmm.
And one person, two people, but I had access to all the data. So I could see line by line how people responded to each individual question. And that was just demographics, but it was way more information that I felt comfortable having. And I was, uh, swore on pain of death that I wouldn't reveal the information. Of course, I respected that, but it really did put me in that awkward position where someone could have asked a question and I would have had to say, I can't answer that. So I'm a big proponent of going external, to your point, to create that space where people feel comfortable sharing and they don't feel that their boss is going to find out, that HR is looking at them funny. It's such personal information that I think it's really important that it is shared or collected externally.
Mm-hmm.
So what about the third group, organizations that haven't started? How would you advise them on where they begin their journey of collecting data?
Yeah. Well, read Inclusalytics. No, I'm kidding.
Right. Yeah.
No, but seriously, my point with that is start by gaining an understanding of what this is, because I can guarantee you every organization has some DEI related data. They just may not be looking at it that way, right? Because whenever an organization says, yeah, we haven't done this yet, I'm like, okay, well, you haven't, even if it's an Excel file with all your employee information, you have demographic data. You just haven't started breaking it down. And so telling them to determine their why. If we want to start collecting DEI data, what's our focus? Most people, when they say they want to do that, they're thinking of diversity and they want to know their breakdown. Okay, if that's the case, then we need to look at this. But it is becoming more popular, especially given the climate, for people to say, well, actually, I want to focus on inclusion, or I want my people to feel like they belong. Okay, well, if you want people to feel like they belong, we need to ask them, do they feel like they belong? Because maybe you're all right. Maybe you don't have to do anything else, but you got to at least ask to figure out where they are, right? And so that would be my suggestion to you. If you currently are not looking at DEI data, sit down and determine why are you considering doing it?
So one of the arguments that I have certainly heard is legal concerns from clients who say, well, if we collect that data, we're opening up ourselves to a lawsuit. How do you address, particularly in the US, how do you address that fear that collecting demographic information, inclusion survey data may lead to getting sued?
Yep. So I have two thoughts there. One is that it's not a secret, especially when we're thinking about diversity data, your employees can look around and they can see your makeup. So you collecting that data and saying like, hey, this is actually our numbers, they won't be surprised. In fact, I've actually seen the opposite happen a number of times where people can only see their small segment. And so they're making assumptions about the whole organization, but truly you're more diverse than that. So being transparent in itself can help you with perceptions, right? So that's one side of things. And then similarly there, with things not being a surprise, is your culture, right? If we were to think of inclusive behaviors or feelings of belonging, again, not a secret. People can typically look around and see how people are treating each other and start making some assumptions. So collecting that data just helps get a clear picture of what's going on. Now, the other piece is where I say I'm not a lawyer, so it's not official legal advice, and it is definitely US centric. But in the US, for better or worse, the law is really on an organization side. And if you look at things around disparate impact and things like that, what they're looking for is that you are putting in, quote, a genuine effort on addressing the issues. And then it's like, okay, well, you're trying. And so then it's okay. And so that's the key, right? Is if you're afraid of the legal piece, just make sure that you collect the data, you make a plan based on the data and you follow through with actioning that plan. Because as long as you do that, they don't really have much of a leg to stand on for suing you. So instead of, oh, and if they were to sue you, you'd have to do that process anyway. So instead of being retroactive, let's be proactive. Let's have it ready to go. And I'll say anecdotally, I speak to a lot of people who are clients, who are internal. I speak to a lot of other DEI consultants. I don't see a lot of organizations taking these actions and then having their internal people come up and start suing them out the wazoo, right? Most of the time they're like, oh, this is great. I finally feel heard. Thank you for doing this. I understand it'll take some time, but as long as, again, you're showing that true, genuine effort, you're not just being performative, but you truly are collecting this data, actioning it, the lawsuits don't come. The lawsuits come when they don't see that. They come when you aren't collecting data, when you aren't making these strategies, when you aren't taking the actions. So the very data you're afraid of is what you'll need to do in the end to get you out of it.
Yeah, and I would say that, keeping in mind that I'm also not a lawyer, but that there are different laws on either side of the border. There are ways to collect the data that it's respectful, it is inclusive, it does not leave people feeling excluded. And the reality is that if someone's feeling excluded, whether you collect the data or not, there is the potential for a lawsuit.
Oh, 100%.
Right? We live in a litigious society. So, it can happen. If law firms and universities can be sued for allowing free speech or not allowing free speech, then anything is possible. Not collecting the data or collecting the data really, I don't think, makes a difference. I think that's one of those kind of mythical arguments that people come up, like the Alaska Airlines comment, like, this is not stuff that's actually happening. You're just maybe making up excuses to get out of kind of, asking the questions. So we've got a question here. What can idea practitioners and champions do when there are situations of data gating? And that's in quotes. I think this person's talking about where HR is not willing to share the data with idea practitioners, perhaps. Maybe you could share some comments there.
Oh yeah, that happens. Just putting that data behind the curtain, right? And only the Wizard of Oz can see it. And so it's not the right answer. And it kind of ties it back into that concern around legal. And I get that, right? And we want to keep things confidential and anonymous as possible and protect people from having their personal information out there. 100% agree. There are still ways where we can do that, to where only one person or maybe a small people analytics team, whatever that team is, has access to that raw data. Like we said, hopefully external, even better. But internally, what is the damage of people being able to see this aggregate data and say, hey, overall, here's where we are? There's nothing. And honestly, that gatekeeping causes just a bottleneck. It just slows all of these things down when we can't provide it. And so it stops people from being able to do their jobs. If only HR has access and you have a DEI department, so now they have to go through them, and all of a sudden they're essentially kind of reporting to them, right? You have ERGs, and you want those employee resource groups, those business resource groups, whatever you call them, you want them to have that business impact, yet you won't give them access to data. Well, how are they going to impact the business, right? You want managers, you want to hold your leaders accountable to help you build this environment, but you aren't giving them access to data. How are they going to do that, right? And so that's my response, is like, you need to find a way to paint that picture to HR, explain how you protect it, get some guidelines in place on the level of access, right? If we don't have at least 3 responses, we're not gonna make that a data point that people can see. Cool, that helps with protections. So have the protections in place, explain the protections, but also explain why it's so important. And again, what the data is going to be used for, right? We don't just want to put the data out there so everyone can be nosy and see what we have going on. You want to put the data out there so you can actually keep moving forward towards your goals.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a bunch of things there, but um, this idea that somehow, whether it's HR or whoever, is kind of hoarding the data and being like, no, we can't share this with you. I think transparency is such a critical part of our work in the idea space, is
Mhm.
making sure that we aren't hiding, that we are being open and honest in our communications. These are what the numbers tell us. I know
Yeah.
Accenture has been very public about sharing their data publicly about their representation at levels in the organization. And that then holds them to account. Like, if you're serious about this, then that transparency is important. And again, hoarding that data, nothing's actually changing. It's not, you're not going to get anywhere if you kind of hold all your cards close to the table, close to your chest. Just as a reminder, if you're listening in, please feel free to share a comment or question in the chat, in the Q&A, depending on the platform you're on, and we will get to them. We've got another question here. Can you share an example or two of how a company has effectively measured the less quantitative, the E and the I, the equity and inclusion, for example? And what were the numbers and questions used?
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny you say that because I would say they're not necessarily, well, as they're still quantifiable. We just don't always think of them in that way, right? And diversity is very, it's just so clearly quantifiable because it is literally defined as numbers. But with equity, if we're talking about the policies, practices, and procedures we put in place to elevate those who have historically been left behind, that's what we're looking at. What are our policies, practices, procedures, and how are they impacting those in our organization? And so the way you quantify that, most popular, we look at pay equity, right? So that's looking at numbers. Who's getting paid what? Is it comparable to everyone else? And it matters, if they have a similar background, specifics. There's a whole process around that. But people tend to stop there when we look at equity. But that's not the only thing we want equitable is our pay, right? You have a parental leave policy. Who's taking advantage of that? Is it having the impact you want? Your flex work policy, how's that impacting people? And so on, right? We could go through so many policies and procedures you have. Who are your high potential employees? Who's being selected? Who's being promoted? Who's being recruited, right? Who are your vendors? There's so many ways we can look at equity. So those are a few examples, but the point of the story is you need that demographic diversity data to look at equity. That's where we tie them together.
Right.
It's Now, the other piece you asked about was inclusion. Again, can feel really touchy-feely if we just say, well, I define inclusion as behaviors. It's a verb, it's what you do. But when we first say it, we just say it like, oh, inclusion, we want people to feel included. We use the word to define the word. But if we use the definition I said of inclusion is a behavior, it's a verb, it's what we do, that automatically makes it more measurable, right? Because now we can go and we can measure behaviors. And there, it is a survey typically. It might be a 360, could be really powerful, or even a 180, but you need to ask other people how that person is interacting. So my manager asked me for my opinion, right? My manager will modify their management style to fit my needs. My manager uses inclusive language. So that's one. It could also be my senior leadership, whatever, but still it's asking about the other person's behaviors and then putting that in frequency versus just strongly agree to disagree. So never, sometimes, always. When we start doing it like that, it's even more measurable because it's like, okay, this person's doing this sometimes, this person's never doing this. Okay, they really need some training so we can get them to the level we want them to be and what we're expecting. So those are a few example questions and types of data, hopefully helpful.
Yeah, you talk about this in the book, and I was actually quite interested in that, is the frequency piece.
Yeah.
And I hadn't considered it or looked at it in that way previously of, this person exemplifies the behavior that, and measuring it through a 360 is a great idea. There are lots of things that you can do to measure the equity and inclusion of an organization, as well as the accessibility. Like, let's not forget the need to measure accessibility. There are things like, focus groups and inclusion surveys. That's measuring those things as long as you have that demographic data. So when you conduct focus groups, you need to be doing those as demographic groups. So you do a session for women, you do a session for people of color, et cetera. So you make sure that you are looking at the inclusion through the demographic lens. It's not that complicated. It's just not as concrete as those representation numbers, as the diversity piece, because it's more about feelings rather than about identity.
Yep. Yeah. Because there is you can do, even with inclusion, right? We can find all these ways to make it more quantitative, but there's still some subjectiveness behind it. It's not all completely objective, and people have thing in their memory, but the closer you can get, the better. And again, just drilling down into what's your why are you doing this? It'll help you with doing that focus. And but one other thing I wanted to mention too, with the qualitative piece, that and the importance there. Actually, you know what? There was something I was going to say and it flew out of my head because I started talking about the quantitative. It'll come back to me and I'll put it out there. But something important about qualitative data collection. I don't know.
Excellent. And when it comes back, you just go start talking about it randomly, even if it doesn't make sense. There's a comment actually in here that I want to read out, and I think it really resonates. Is the real importance is how the data is used, not if it's collected. It always feels like this is an excuse to not do anything and ensure issues are looked over. Absolutely. It's what you do with the data. And I tell people all the time, don't ask the questions if you don't want to know the answers. If you're not going to do something with the data, just don't collect. Yeah. You need to really use that information. If the whole objective is, to make your workplace more inclusive and equitable, use that data to serve that purpose. But it is not something you should be asking if you're not actually going to use it.
Yeah, I have a slide I use when I do these DEI and data talks, and it hits on that. One of the concerns that people will say is, well, DEI is just about telling us, why we're bad people. That's all it is. It's about pointing out problems without solutions. And that's my comment, is that's not it. The point is to help us with solutions. And so, yeah, I saw that comment and I love it because it's such a true point. And I say the exact same thing to people, Michael. I sit there with them for an hour and we talk about how important data is and how they need more data. And then I'm like, but by the way, if you're not ready to do anything with it, don't collect the data, because truly it does more damage in the end than if you just hadn't collected it, right? Because when you collect that data, you now ask your employees to be vulnerable or to just take their time in some way, shape, or form. They have provided you this insight, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you either A, are not transparent with the data, or B, you don't use it at all, now you've broken that, right? And so now they have trust issues, and we are steps behind where we would have been had we never even opened that door.
Absolutely. I remember one client, this is years ago, where we conducted a survey for them, and they weren't happy with the results. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't change the report because, ethics. And they put out messages saying that everything was great. Everything's great. Thank you so much for your feedback. And it was not great. It was disastrous. And the result was a significant uptick in voluntary turnover. Mm. They saw a lot of people were like, hell, this is, because either they knew they were lying, or, well, maybe I'm the only one experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever. So they decided to leave. Another question.
I remember the thing. I remember the data thing. Came back to me. That just helped me. So the other thing I would add, just as like a quick tip for you, if you're doing these focus groups, these interviews, people are participating. Again, hopefully with an external. So I talked about the concern of trust and being able to be open. And that example is a great one, right? Of maybe even if we narrow it down to Black women, if I'm the only Black woman in here not having the same experience, I might not even want to speak up in that focus group, right? So what I like to do when I'm doing qualitative data collection as an external practitioner is say, hey, we're going to talk in this moment, but if you have something you're uncomfortable saying in front of other people, type it out to me, send it to me in an email, right? So giving them other ways to still contribute their thoughts, but to help with that anonymity, because qualitative data honestly is a gold mine. You get so much, because if we're trying to build things to help these people, what better way to find out how to do it than to talk to them? But they want to be protected because there's so much fear around being open and vulnerable. So the more you can protect that for them, yeah. So that was my thought. Using that ability to write in their comments for those groups too.
Yeah, great point. We've got another question here. What do you make of the recent anti-DEI regulations and sentiment in the US? And also, tech leaders like Meta and Google cutting down on DEI initiatives and promises is a bit concerning. What are your thoughts? I know I got some.
Concerning is an understatement, right? We live in interesting times where we have made a lot of progress, and I do not want to downplay that, right? There are people I like to talk to, I recognize my age. I know I'm a little younger. I speak to people who've been doing this, 40 years, and they're like, y'all youngins need to calm down. Like, we have done a lot. We're making progress. So I never want to downplay that. However, we also saw a lot backtrack, right? 2020, things exploded. And in the past year or two, especially, we've seen people like, ooh, hold up, let's slow down. We're upsetting too many people. How do we cater to them? And so, yeah, it's scary. And I understand that. And it's okay to have those feelings. So this is my permission to you to be it's okay to be nervous, but stop, right? We can't completely give in. And so it's important to make sure that we are still doing the work, finding ways to do the work, try and push the message, again, get people back to the core of what we mean. At times it doesn't hurt to reframe in this space, and not necessarily use those really strong words that, if there's a term that sets people off. I have one client that they do not like the word equity. So I just don't say the word equity to make them happy, but I'm still doing everything that's helping with equity, right? And so we do everything. And then I'll every once in a while, I'll be like, oh yeah, and this is equity, but it's not plastered on the title, So there is some creativity involved in this space right now. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna pause there. Michael, you had some things too. I want to hear what you got on your mind.
Listen, I mean, the whole reason I created this series was because I feel like there is this narrative being taken away, and it is a small minority. And I say that, but if you look at the data, if you look at the numbers of from Gallup and other really reputable, emphasize reputable organizations that are collecting, doing surveys and polls and that sort of thing, the vast majority of Canadians and Americans, and I'm talking 80+%, are supporters of inclusion. Would I like it to be 100%? Absolutely, but I'll take 80%. And we've got this small narrative, whether it's the former president of the United States, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, they are taking over the narrative with their dog whistle politics, and it's hurting people. And I think the solution to that is to double down. I think organizations like Google and Meta and organizations that have cut their DEI budgets, fired DEI staff, et cetera, they are going to regret that because their people are going to vote with their feet. Investors are going to vote with their feet. And I think they will regret it. And I think this is a stay the course kind of thing. Listen, I've been in this game for 20 years. And in 20 years, I have seen lots of these moments where, people are pulling back and, oh, we need to cut that budget and we can't say the word diversity, et cetera, et cetera. It happens. We will get through this, but we have to persevere and we have to stick together as a community.
Yeah, definitely.
I've got another question here. As an idea practitioner, I often have individuals come and share personal stories about their experiences with the company where they feel excluded, face barriers, et cetera. I think this is important information, but often get the response that it's hard to make change from an individual perspective, and that it is not legitimate data. Yes, that it's not legitimate data. Any advice on how to help employees feel heard if they share informally?
Yeah, no, this is great. And first I would say collecting data informally like that is very important and valuable. So make sure you're doing it. But the key behind this is to track it. So they may informally tell you these things. You can still make a log, right? You don't have to use names. You can use whatever identifier you want that makes sense, right? Include a couple of notes and have a theme for what this falls under. Because if you're hearing this from multiple people, now you have something, right? So now you can say, hey, I had 10 people of this 15-person team come and say X about how their manager is treating them, right? Okay, now it's not just one person versus if you only had that one and you're like, hey, so and so. So that's always my thing is how make sure you're tracking your data, even if it's informal.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are also tools that you can implement. One is called Hear You, HEARU, that allows you to collect data anonymously. So people can report those experiences anonymously. There's no mechanism to then elevate those things, those complaints, but at least it captures the data so you understand how many people are experiencing that, and you can then start to adjust accordingly.
Yeah. Or if you have a low budget and you're trying to do this, really simple, make a Google form. It can be that simple, right? And
Yeah.
like there are ways, so there's so many ways you could also collect that, or encourage them to. If you have a process and they tell you informally, encourage them to say, hey, are you sure you don't want to do this formal process that we also have in place? That can be helpful too.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't have to be complicated. Um, we're almost out of time, but there's one question here that I really want to get to. If you have a public service organization, let's say a library, where you're not collecting patron data, how do you make data-informed decisions to show progress on idea? That's an interesting one to me.
Public facing. So they're saying
The
like
customer.
what are we doing with our customers? Well, first I would say you're not collecting data of your customers right now. There's nothing saying you can't. So we can all of the methods, and I have some clients who that's what we do. I have one in particular that always comes to mind where they're a membership organization and we took everything that we do for employees normally and we do it all for their members. So doing those listening sessions, doing our survey and so on. So look for ways to still collect data and hear that employee voice. The anonymous reporting we just talked about, that can still happen. Because I think that's something we didn't touch on today is I use employees a lot because that's where we tend to start to focus. But all of this data collection you need to do with your customers who you're serving and also your vendors, right? So who's working with you? So making sure that you're getting insight from your vendors and suppliers as well.
Yeah, it's not that hard. It is not fair to say that the community you serve is the customer. A library, as an example, it's one thing to say, oh, here's what the city of New York looks like, or the city of Toronto, or wherever, but that's not to say that all of those people go to the library. So it's a matter of asking the question, finding out who's coming through the door, finding out how they're enjoying their experiences. It is important information to have.
Yep.
It's just a little deeper dive. Last question, Sertrice. Where can people connect with you?
Oh, yes. You can connect with me best on LinkedIn. I'm always on there. I tell people all the time, it comes to my phone. And so it's like texting me. And then if you want to see also pictures of my dog, then follow me on Instagram and you'll get a little bit of DEI and some fun Sertrice life.
Fantastic. Well, we will paste links to both your Instagram and LinkedIn in the chat, and people can connect with you there. Thank you for joining me for today, engaging in this conversation. I could not have thought of a better guest for my first episode of my new web series and podcast to have on to talk about data and measurement than the one and only Sertrice Shipley. So thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me to be your first guest. I realized that and I was like, oh, I'm so special. So thanks.
You are special. And do pick up Sertrice's book, Inclusalytics, How Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leaders Use Data to Drive Their Work, at inclusalytics.com. And someone in one of the social platforms was asking about an audiobook, and apparently it's available on Audible. Why do they make all those words sound alike? Thank you to all of you who tuned in. I hope you found the discussion informative and valuable. If you did, please feel free to post it on your social media using the hashtag Ideas with Michael Bach. And if you didn't enjoy it, there is no need to tell anyone. Just keep that to yourself. Speaking of social media, if you haven't already done so, please do connect with me on social media. I am at the Michael Bach on all the social media platforms. And the next episode of Ideas with Michael Bach will air on Wednesday, February the 14th, Valentine's Day, at 1 p.m. Eastern or GMT +5, where my guest will be Pharrell Hall, Chief Inclusion and People Officer for 9 Story Media Group. And we'll be talking about the importance of inclusive communications as part of the inclusive communications theme. I know that wasn't terribly original, but anyway, I hope you'll join for that conversation. And if you haven't already registered, you can do so at michaelbach.com/ideas or again on social media. Thanks again for joining us today, and I look forward to talking with you again.